So today, as you can probably already tell from the title, I'm going to talk about how to tell if you have an antique or a vintage tie. Now, I exclusively wear antique vintage ties. I really found out about them. I'd say a couple years ago, and what can I say? I was hooked. And I've sold them, I've bought them, I've had collections, I've let parts of that collection go. So I in my daily life, whenever I dress up or if there's a get together or just really any chance I can get to wear a tie, it'll be antique or vintage. So I've got a few here with me right now. So I'm just gonna look at some of the distinguishing marks of antique and vintage ties to hopefully help you in the future better determine and be able to pick them out from a crowd. So let's look at those. Now there are a lot of ways people describe vintage or antique for that matter. Now to some people the 80s and 90s are vintage just because they had different things than we have now. Um, and vintage as far as clothing could be the 80s, 70s, 60s, and really beyond. It's just kind of a interchangeable term that people use to refer to things that aren't in style anymore. But specifically for this video, I'm going to look at ties, let's say the 20s through the 50s. Those are the majority of the ties I have in my collection. I think maybe I have one or two from the 60s, but really the early 1950s and older is the stuff that really has these definitive markings. So just diving into it, the first thing most people notice right off the bat about antique ties is they do not have a loop in the back. Now, just so you know what I'm talking about, because some people don't really understand this concept, especially if you don't wear a lot of ties. Modern ties will have a loop right here. It's usually the label of the tie, the brand name or whatever, and that is for taking this short end here and you put it through the loop and it holds them together. Antique ties didn't have that, and I think until I want to say there were a few oddballs in like the late 50s, but as a constantly occurring thing, the loop pass through, they call it a pass through label on the back of the tie, didn't really get popular until like the real late 60s, early 70s. You can still find some ties from the first few years in the 70s that didn't have them. So that is the first marking of being a vintage tie of some sort, is that it will not have that pass-through label right here. Now, this tie, I would say, is from the late 30s or early 40s. And so, it's definitely a very old one. And one of the other things that people notice when they get to looking at old ties a little closer is that the ends, here I'll put that up there so you can see it, the ends are not square. If you get a modern tie and you put that up there, actually, you know what I should do? I should go get a modern tie. This is one of my grandpa's ties with this lovely fishing lure motif. Now what I was saying about the ends. Modern ties have very square ends. I mean, look at those. They have nice seams. They're folded over. It's very square. There's no loose ends. There's not any flaps of fabric, and that's quite the opposite with, I'll just use this guy again. I mean, just compare the ends here on an antique tie and a modern tie. I mean, this isn't even the same size as over here. This is kind of square. They tried. It's the blade is pointed, but they're not even ends of fabric, because what they did for antique ties is it was one piece of fabric. This is a long, if you took it all apart, it would be a square or rectangle piece of fabric. And they kind of shaped the blades, ironed them down, hemmed them over, and then just folded them to make more uniform, I guess, pieces. And this is, that tie was from the 30s. Here's another one from the 30s, a little later. Same type of deal with the ends and, no label. This is the 40s. This one, searching the patent date number on it, it actually brought up 1949. Cat just came in. 1949 as the year for this one. Now, this one, they started to make them a little nicer then. You got a little nicer, but if you took your finger and went like this, it's still two pieces of fabric. It's still two separate, it's not stitched together all nice. And you'll notice the end on this one is still uneven. So this is from the later 40s. Now here's one from the 1950s, and same thing. The ends aren't even, and there's no loop, and yeah, there's a few uniform things that you're just gonna get with antique ties, and it's gonna be the same no matter what you do. Also, one of the things is length and width to consider. Now, these first two here that I showed you aren't very good examples of width because in the 1920s and 1930s, ties were very modest. They were thin, they were, dull colors. They weren't really meant to be statement pieces. And then when the late 30s hit and, everybody wanted to be all crazy, then you got stuff like this and your Art Deco patterns, and people had this fascination with really fat ties. I mean, they had ties that were 5 inches thick, that it looked like a bib. I mean, it's kind of stupid looking. I wouldn't go for something that outrageous, but they were wide. And so they got wide, really, really fat in about the late 30s and stayed that way for the first part of the 50s, I'd say the early 50s, and then they got really thin again. And lengthwise. Now, if I stand up here, I can show you. Antique ties were not meant to sit, on the belt like ties do now. They were actually meant to be a good, hand, a good few inches above the waistline. I know partially that was due to the fact that men's pants waistlines were higher back then, but that's mostly just because that was the style. And like all styles, you don't know where it comes from. I've heard a few theories about that. Probably the most logical one was people like Oliver Hardy would wear their ties really short to be comical, to be funny, and then the look kind of backfired and caught on as a fashion trend. And myself, like I said, wearing antique ties all the time, that is the most frequent comment I get about how I'm tying my tie wrong, or my tie's for children, or whatever. I mean, I've had a waitress tell me, that's a nice tie, do they make it in adult sizes? So, that was fun. Unfortunately, most people don't know, but like I said, antique ties were made to sit up higher, and I guess people that aren't into them and aren't into that type of fashion wouldn't get that. But that's one reason why I put this video out here, because, hopefully more people will get educated. Because right now, the only people that know about this are the people that are into antique ties. So alright, you're, at the thrift store, at the antique store, wherever you'd come across a tie that you suspect might be old. Just a recap, no loop on the back. The ends are uneven, and when you tie it, it sits up shorter. Seems like no matter what you do, it's too short. It's supposed to be like that. Chances are you've got a pretty old tie. Now, this isn't foolproof. I would imagine it works for me, but like everything else you learn to do, it took a couple years to hone it, to fine-tune it. It's not an immediate skill. It's not something that you can just kind of like watch this video and then go out and, oh, I'm gonna spot all the birds are going crazy. You can go out and spot all the antique ties. It takes practice. I've had ties that I thought were from the 60s simply because of the color. Uh, I mean, stuff like this. Honestly, it was kind of this color, and it had this real geometric looking pattern on it, and the fabric was kind of sparkly, and I said, man, that really looks like just something out of the 60s. Then I saw an advertisement for it in an old catalog. Comes to find out it was from the 1930s. So, every once in a while you'll run across something that maybe you think is old and it's not, or you don't think is old and it is. But I hope this video has kind of clarified that, and I hope that you can go out and it works for you like it did for me. Well, thanks for watching.